Hey, welcome back to the show. The federal government commitment to invest heavily in infrastructure to kickstart the economy saw a committee hearing from groups yesterday with proposals for projects to be considered. Colleges and Institutes Canada presented a list of 800 shovel-ready projects worth about $7.6 billion. A new report from the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Canada is calling on the government to create a national infrastructure bank to deliver the plan. And to find out more about it, I'm pleased to be joined this morning by Matti Siemiatycki, Associate Professor of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. How are you, Matti?
I'm well. Good morning.
I'm glad you could join us. Now, maybe explain what is a national infrastructure bank.
So the idea with a national infrastructure bank is that it would be a central institution that would provide lending services to municipalities and provinces. So currently, those levels of government borrow money on their own. And what this would do is provide lending services backed by the federal government, and therefore it would lower the borrowing costs for these municipalities and increase access to capital for some of them. So the goal is that ideally it would lower some of the interest rates and borrowing costs associated with providing all of this infrastructure that we're going to be building.
Aren't interest rates at bottom basement prices right now?
They are, and there is a bit of a difference between what the federal government can borrow at with its top-ranked credit rating and what some of the municipalities and provinces can borrow at. But your idea is correct. There actually, when you look at it in more detail, there actually isn't that much of a difference. It's about 1.25%. So anyone who's taking out a loan on a mortgage on a house knows that there is some difference there, but it has to be on a pretty big amount of money before it really starts to make a significant difference in monthly payments.
In terms of a national infrastructure bank, who would it report to? The federal government?
So this is being proposed at the federal level. So it would be a federal institution that would report to the federal government.
I wonder, does this not just create another level of bureaucracy?
That's one of the risks, and what I'm proposing in the report is really that if it just focuses on financing, it's going to have a fairly minimal impact because of what we were just talking about, that the interest rate differences actually aren't that great, and that municipalities and provinces can actually borrow money quite easily. They're not having a problem borrowing money. The problem our levels of government are having is paying the money back, and an infrastructure bank doesn't really solve that problem. That's at the level of revenues and cuts, and governments are having a really hard time with raising revenues, especially, and making cuts as well. So the infrastructure bank, while it lowers the cost of financing a little bit, it doesn't necessarily solve this issue of where the money is going to come from to pay back the initial borrowing.
Matti Siemiatycki is Associate Professor of Geography Planning at the University of Toronto and wrote the report for the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Canada, calling on the federal government to create a national infrastructure bank to make do with the lowest interest rates ever to get this infrastructure, to pay for infrastructure and get it out the door, as the Liberals had promised to do that to get the economy going. Now, basically, how would it operate for, you get a small municipality, they just put in their submission and it goes through the process there?
So what I find in the report is actually that this program, the Federal Infrastructure Bank, won't actually be useful for small municipalities. The minimum size of the project needs to be around $10 million before it starts to have a significant impact. Below that value, what I'm proposing and what others have proposed as well is that the federal government really expands block grants, because it's expensive to administer these programs. The infrastructure bank has to have staff, and they have to review all of the proposals. As you mentioned in your intro, they're getting hundreds of submissions, and to review all of those in careful detail is really expensive and time-consuming. And so the goal is that for smaller municipalities and for smaller projects, this money would be flowed through to them through block grants, and it's only at the bigger scale of projects when you're getting above 10 million and really into the 50 million, 100 million, and into the billion-dollar projects that you really want to be using something like an infrastructure bank to vet those projects. And I think that's really the key here, is that where this will deliver value and could be a game changer is if it starts to move into overseeing and aiding with project selection, as well as financing and delivery, because we have a huge problem with picking the wrong projects. And then we have a problem with cost overruns once these projects are being delivered. So really, if the infrastructure bank can provide this suite of programs, not just private financing, or project financing, then I think it can really have a big difference.
What would be the criteria for a successful project?
So what I'm proposing in the report is that the federal institution wouldn't choose projects, but rather what they would do is ensure that there actually is a cost-benefit analysis, so that evidence-based planning is really being done, and that these projects that are being selected appear at the top of priority lists of the government that's proposing them. Because what we find right now is that many projects proceed with very little evidence, and they also often come out of the blue and don't appear at the top of the priority list. They're not our highest priorities. They're often shovel-ready, but they're not necessarily shovel-worthy. And so what we're finding is that the problem with infrastructure is not just finding the money, it's actually picking the projects that are going to deliver the best benefit. We need to get much more systematic about that and use evidence to make those decisions. And I think what the infrastructure bank could do is provide an incentive, an encouragement for provinces and municipalities applying for funding to have to carry out those studies first. And that's also one of the reasons why you want this to be done really for the biggest types of projects, because those studies are expensive, they are time consuming, but they are worthwhile for big projects when we're allocating tens, if not hundreds, or even billions of dollars to infrastructure.
I can understand that. I'm just kind of looking at how you would grade whether a project would be, would qualify as opposed to one that wouldn't. You mentioned shovel-worthy, I guess, more than shovel-ready.
So the key is that there are approaches of conducting cost-benefit analysis and different technical tools that can be used to appraise whether projects are going to actually deliver the benefits that are being proposed for them. And you'd be stunned how many projects, even projects that are costing tens of millions of dollars, don't ever go through that vetting before they get approved. They get selected for political reasons, then they get floated in the media, everyone gets behind them, and before you know it, you're going down a path before you've done really any technical study of whether these promises are really going to be met. And so I think what the infrastructure bank could do is not just provide this financing role, which is important, but also encourage governments across the country to do this upfront evidence-based planning. Because again, we don't just have a problem with money. The issue is, we have scarce resources, and if we allocate it poorly, we're not going to get the benefits that we require, and we're also going to drown ourselves in amounts of debt.
Yeah, evidence-based is the key there, and I'm a little surprised that we're hearing about all these projects that are just sort of being rolled right out, or had in the past been rolled out, but evidence didn't really back them up.
Well, you can think of the projects that sort of hit the front pages of the newspapers. You can think of the gazebos in the Muskokas, where essentially, essentially those projects, by all accounts, were the plans never really were significantly vetted with technical evidence about what the benefits were going to be. That was in large measure political expedience. At least that's what the Auditor General report seems to suggest. And so, we really need to be getting beyond that method of conducting planning because the resources are too scarce. We can't afford it to be making big mistakes. The problem with infrastructure is it's not just the capital costs that are expensive, it's also the ongoing operations and maintenance. Once you build these things, you have to actually run them, and that costs significant dollars too. So if you're making bad decisions about the projects, it really compounds over time and will cost you in the long run.
Matti, I want to thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend, all right?
Yeah, you too.
All righty. Matti Siemiatycki is Associate Professor of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto, and he wrote the report for the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Canada, in particular, looking at infrastructure spending. The federal government making no bones about they plan on going into deficit spending, investing heavily in infrastructure through the campaign, after they want it. And what the report is suggesting is a national infrastructure bank to leverage that money for the lowest possible interest rate and more oversight on projects that are shovel-worthy as opposed to shovel-ready. Interesting point, because the bottom line is you can shovel the money out the door, but you still have to pay for it as well. We're going to take a break for news, and on the other side, Dr. Anne Cavoukian is going to join us, the former Ontario Privacy Commissioner, and she is currently the executive director of the Big Data Institute at Ryerson University, and she is in the corner of Apple Inc. in its battle against the FBI.